Chapter 1. Welcome to the System, the Sign in the Window. In 1978, Czech dissident Václav Havel wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. In it, he described a greengrocer who hangs a sign in his shop window that reads, "Workers of the world, unite." The greengrocer doesn't believe it. He may not even think about it. He puts the sign up because everyone puts the sign up. Because not putting it up would be noticed. Because the cost of removing it, the questions, the scrutiny, the friction, is simply not worth it. So the sign stays. And by staying, it does its work. It tells the system, I am compliant, I am not a threat, I live within the lie. Havel's point was devastating. The power of an unjust system doesn't rest on force alone. It rests on the quiet participation of ordinary people who go along not because they believe, but because they've learned that going along is safer than speaking plainly. Nearly 50 years later, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and invoked Havel directly, describing a world where middle powers had long deferred to great powers, pretending the rules were fair, that the order was just, that compliance would buy safety. Carney said, when even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. He was speaking about geopolitics, but he was also describing something closer to home. Because Canadians have been keeping a sign in the window too. Not a political slogan, a social one. A sign that reads, the system is fair, hard work is enough, the rules are the same for everyone. The social contract holds. We didn't put that sign up because we necessarily believed it. We put it up because the alternative, naming the gap between what we're told and what we live, requires a kind of courage that goes unrewarded and sometimes punished. We put it up because the system taught us to. This book is about taking it down, not with anger, not with despair, but with the clarity that comes from finally seeing the sign for what it is. A performance of a fairness that was never fully real, and a system that depends on our silence to keep running. Once you see the sign, once you take it down, everything changes. Letter to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, your Davos speech was unusually candid. You did not describe a gentle transition in the global order. You described a rupture. And when you invoked Thucydides, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. You were not endorsing that logic. You were warning against ignoring it. You told middle powers that complacency is dangerous, that assuming the old rules still protect them is knave. That go along to get along is no longer a strategy. I agree. And it is precisely because I agree that I believe the same clarity must be applied at home. If middle powers must recognize shifting power asymmetries globally, citizens must recognize shifting power asymmetries domestically. We do not see collapse. We see guided drift, active pressure producing a passive-looking result. Healthcare is still universal, but increasingly stretched. Education is still public, but increasingly stratified by postal code and private supplementation. Housing is still attainable, but increasingly financialized. Tax policy still claims fairness, but continues to privilege asset growth over labor income. None of this is dramatic. That is what makes it powerful. Citizens adjust quietly. They normalize longer waits. They normalize higher fees. They normalize private alternatives. They normalize complexity they do not understand. Philosophically, this is accommodation to asymmetry. Morally, it should concern us, because when economic leverage concentrates, policy follows. not through conspiracy, through incentives, through access, through proximity to decision-making. And when broad civic participation weakens relative to concentrated capital power, the Thucydidean logic reappears, not between states, but within them. Some will say this is a false equivalence, that states operate in an anarchic international system without a higher authority, while citizens have courts, constitutions, and elections to protect them. That objection would carry more weight if the people who write tax codes were not also the primary beneficiaries of those codes. Formal institutions exist. Meaningful accountability is another matter. This is not a left versus right argument. It is a structural one. If power politics has returned globally, economic power politics has been shaping domestic outcomes for years. The question is not whether this is happening. The question is whether we acknowledge it honestly. Urgency does not mean alarmism. It means recognizing that quiet erosion accumulates. If the social contract weakens incrementally, it weakens just the same. If citizens are not shaping the rules, they are absorbing the costs. The path forward does not require revolution. It requires reinforcement, greater transparency in tax design, stronger guardrails protecting public systems from slow privatization, simplification of rules that disproportionately advantage those who can afford expert navigation, cross-partisan recognition that wealth concentration is a structural issue, not a cultural one. You called for middle powers to act collectively in a fractured world. Citizens must be empowered to act collectively in a fractured domestic landscape. Because strength in a democracy should not belong to those with the most leverage. It should belong to the broadest participation. Respectfully, Glenn Koskie, February 2026. The clarity we need at home. That letter was written days after Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos. His speech marked a departure from decades of Canadian diplomatic optimism. He warned that the liberal international order, the system of rules, institutions, and norms that shaped post-war cooperation, was fracturing. That middle powers like Canada could no longer assume protection under that system. That geopolitical power had returned, and complacency was dangerous. The speech was praised for its honesty, its refusal to pretend continuity where rupture existed. But as I listened, I couldn't help noticing what wasn't being said with the same clarity. The same power asymmetries reshaping the global order have been quietly reshaping domestic policy for years. The same pattern of concentrated pressure reshaping outcomes quietly has been happening at home. In healthcare, housing, education, tax policy, and the slow erosion of public systems. It doesn't look steered. That's precisely why it works. We speak honestly about international power imbalances. We speak carefully, if at all, about domestic ones. And that matters. Because the logic Carney invoked, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must, doesn't stop at borders. Critics will argue this is a false equivalence. Thucydides was describing sovereign states in an anarchic world, with no court above them. Domestic life, they say, has rule of law. But that argument assumes the rule of law operates symmetrically. That the person who hires a team of tax lawyers and the person who files a T4 slip are navigating the same system with equal tools. They are not. The mechanism Thucydides identified, power shaping the rules it then operates under, does not require the absence of courts. It requires only that those with sufficient power can afford to shape what the courts are asked to enforce, and what they are quietly allowed to ignore. This book is an attempt to apply the same intellectual honesty to inequality at home that we now apply to geopolitics abroad. Not as a left versus right argument, as a structural one. If you've ever worked hard, played by the rules, paid your taxes, and still felt like you were falling behind, this book is for you. Because here's the truth. The system isn't broken. It has been steered. Year by year, rule by rule, the drift has been nudged in one direction by those with the resources to push. It works exactly as it was built to, just not for you. That realization didn't come to me through a political rant or an economic theory. It came from watching ordinary people, my own family, navigate life with honesty, decency, and grit. My mom and dad, now in their mid-80s, taught us to care for people, to treat others with empathy and kindness, to work hard, and to be honest even when no one was watching. They raised us on the belief that if you gave your best and looked out for others, the world would take care of the rest. But somewhere along the way, the world changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through a guided drift, policy by policy, incentive by incentive, loophole by loophole, steered steadily toward a society where effort matters less than access, where fairness is a slogan rather than a standard, and where the rules are written in a language most people never get to learn. The rules most people never see. In boardrooms, backrooms, and the polite corners of policy, a quiet code evolved. A code that rewards wealth over work, connections over contribution, and manipulation over merit. It's not usually illegal. Often it's invisible. But you feel it. In your paycheck, your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, your anxiety. This book is about that code. It's about the unwritten rules the wealthy, powerful, and well-connected know, and the rest of us were never told. It's about how tax law, public funding, corporate strategy, and even charity have been quietly shaped to serve those at the top. It's about why wages stagnate while rent explodes, why public services shrink while private options grow, and why the people who follow the rules keep losing to those who play the system. No secret cabal, just systemic drift. This book is not arguing that a room full of villains sat down and designed this outcome. It's arguing something both more ordinary and more dangerous. When incentives consistently reward the same behaviors, systems drift. Policies compound, advantages stack. Costs are offloaded downward. But this drift is not random. It has been guided, nudged year by year, by those with the resources and access to do the nudging. Let's get something clear early. This isn't a conspiracy theory. There's no secret society in a candlelit basement pulling levers. What we're living through is more subtle and more dangerous. It's a decades-long guided drift, active pressure creating a passive-looking result. The steering is real, even when the direction of the pressure is invisible. Call it what it is, guided drift. The system looks like it just evolved this way. It didn't. People with resources pushed it, through lobbying, through access, through the patient, persistent shaping of rules in their favor. The result feels inevitable. It was rarely happened by chance. And critically, none of this happened overnight. The principal residence exemption was a reasonable policy designed to protect families from being taxed out of modest homes they'd lived in for decades. The capital gains inclusion rate was set with genuine rationales about encouraging investment. Corporate incorporation rules existed to help small businesses manage risk. Each incentive had a logic, each was defensible in its original context. But over decades, What was designed to protect the middle class became the instrument of a different class entirely. Each provision was found, tested, stretched, and built upon. Tax lawyers identified the gap. Accountants refined the strategy. Lobbyists protected the gap from closure. The next generation of wealthy clients inherited not just money, but the inherited advantage. A compounding of advantage that the original legislators never intended and that most Canadians never knew was happening. This is what accumulation looks like from the outside. A tax system that appears neutral but delivers radically different outcomes depending on whether you earn a salary or own assets. Not because someone designed it that way at a single moment, but because dozens of someones, across decades, across governments of different stripes, each made a small adjustment, closed one loophole while opening another, and the aggregate result is a system that looks like drift, but runs in a very consistent direction. The billionaire class doesn't need secret plans. They have lobbyists. They have accountants and lawyers who fine-tune the rules. They have think tanks and policy institutes. They have charities, private foundations, and public-private partnerships that shape narratives in their favor. The real power of the wealthy isn't in plotting. It's in normalizing. Normalizing inequality. Normalizing tax avoidance. Normalizing the idea that public services must shrink while private interests expand. Normalizing the belief that individual struggle is a personal failure rather than a systemic outcome. Bit by bit, community values get replaced by wealth values. Cooperation gives way to competition. Solidarity yields to suspicion. How the drift works. The pattern repeats across every sector. Public health care weakens, and private clinics appear to help. Public school funding shrinks, and tutoring companies and private academies fill the gap. Doctors leave rural areas, and recruitment targets foreign-trained graduates who complete their studies and move to cities. Rural credit unions close, and corporate banks fill the void at a distance, serving the branch on their terms or not at all. Governments cut services, and charities step up, with priorities shaped by their donors, not the communities that lost the public programs. And when people get frustrated, the system hands them an easier target. Doctor shortage? Must be immigrants. Housing crisis? Must be refugees. Long wait times? Must be lazy workers. Stagnant wages? Must be unions. Anger flows downhill. Responsibility flows nowhere. And the system keeps humming along. The example that opened my eyes. Consider what happens when a Canadian sells their home. Under the principal residence exemption, any profit on the sale of a home you designate as your principal residence is entirely tax-free, regardless of the amount. Sell a house for $400,000 more than you paid. Keep every dollar. No capital gains, no tax. Now consider what happens when you earn $400,000 at work. You pay full marginal income tax, potentially over 50% depending on your province. 2 people, $400,000 each, treated by the tax system as though they are in entirely different universes. The exemption was designed to protect families from being taxed out of homes they had lived in for decades. That original purpose was reasonable. But the same provision that protects a retired couple selling the farmhouse they built in 1974 also shelters profits from a property held strategically and sold in a rising market, with no distinction in the tax treatment between the two. They're not cheating. They're following the code. The real scandal isn't what they're doing. It's that the system applies the same rule to both situations as though they represent the same thing. Meanwhile, working families pay tax on every shift. Renters get no deductions. People living paycheck to paycheck face late fees, NSF charges, and interest penalties. With no tax provision in sight, you can play the game only if you know the rules. And for most people, the rule book was never handed out. The confidence drain. The system doesn't just drain bank accounts, it drains confidence. When you feel like you're losing despite working hard, the system whispers, budget better, work harder, make better choices, stop complaining. It trains people to internalize blame rather than identify causes. Shame is an excellent tool for maintaining inequality. A confused, isolated, ashamed population doesn't challenge much. But when you understand that the rules were written without you in mind, and often against your interests, something changes. You stop blaming yourself. You stop taking the outcomes personally. You start seeing patterns. You begin to understand power. That moment, when the fog lifts, is where this book begins. Fairness isn't a feeling. It's a formula. In Canada, we love to tell ourselves we're fair, polite, and balanced. But fairness isn't cultural. It's structural. It's measurable. The numbers tell the same story in every domain. Work is taxed more heavily than wealth. Public services shrink while private alternatives expand and begin charging for access. Rural communities lose the institutions that once anchored them, while urban developers receive incentives. Corporations externalize their risks onto workers and the public purse while privatizing the gains. Charitable structures serve donor influence and tax strategy as much as they serve generosity. Wealth compounds across generations. Wages erode in real terms. These are not unrelated problems. They are the outputs of a single integrated system, one built to advantage those with assets, connections, and knowledge, while instructing everyone else to try harder. Welcome to the system. You don't have to like it. You just have to see it. Because once you see the system clearly, everything makes more sense. Everything feels less like your fault, and everything becomes easier to challenge. Understanding is the first spark of resistance. And now that you're here, now that the curtain has been pulled back, let's start pulling the whole thing apart.